Legend of Total War here, and today we're doing another Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires campaign review, this time covering Gorbad Ironclaw and also touching on the Greenskin update that came with Gorbad. So, just touching on the update first. This was a bit of a nothing burger, very small update, but the Greenskins didn't really need a overhaul. The rework that they got with Warden and the Paunch back in 2020 was a pretty substantial rework, and at the time was one of the best reworks. But as of now, I would rate it probably about a 7 out of 10 rework. But it has worked well for them in Warhammer 2, and I think it works reasonably well for them in Warhammer 3 as well. So they didn't need to basically, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, basically. So some of the choices they made with the update was a little bit weird if you have that mindset. So firstly, looking at the big thinking, the previous tech tree was fine, and this tech tree is fine as well. I feel like it's exactly the same. They've moved some things around, but the overall impact is exactly the same. So, you know that meme from The Office where she's looking at two photos and she goes, it's exactly the same? That's this. And so I feel like it's just a waste of time. Like, previous one or this one, take it or leave it, it's the same. Maybe this one here has a few nerfs to goblins. Like, it's not quite as strong for the goblins as the previous one. But I don't think that really matters that much. So it's just a bit of a nothing burger. Looking at their city structures, there's a few changes made here. So if we have a look, Black Orcs now are able to be recruited at tier 3 instead of tier 4. That's obviously a buff for the Greenskins. But Black Orcs they've never been really one of my favorite units unless it's specifically buffed by like Grimgore. But now you've got access to Black Orcs with shields and Black Orcs with great weapons. So these were the original ones. Now they've added a unit ability for Black Orcs with great weapons. This ability sucks in most cases because the loss of melee defense there, minus 24, that brings your melee defense from 32 down to like 8. That will actually make it so that units that were attacking you that may have had like a 30% chance of hitting you are now going to hit you way more often. And so you're probably going to end up taking more than 50% extra damage. And that means you'll take entity losses faster, which means you'll actually have less damage output. So even though you're getting base weapon damage and armor piercing damage plus 50% for those remaining orcs, those orcs are going to die fairly quickly. This is a bad ability. That's not very good. But when you look at this one here, for example, Immovable Bulwark, increasing melee defense at the cost of melee attack, that actually is fine because the purpose of this unit is to be durable. This makes it more durable so that it holds the line a lot better. It's not going to take as much damage so that other units can go in and inflict the damage. So with this one here, for example, what other unit is benefiting from these guys dying quicker? I don't know. So it's a very mismatched ability with this. What I really think it should be is that this should really add on extra melee attack on top of this, because this would be good to use against like dwarfs. So dwarfs, typically speaking, have very high melee defense. If it was, because honestly, 50 weapon strength, mostly armor piercing, that's fine. You don't need extra 50% on that. But if you're going up against an Ironbreaker, for example, and they've got 60 melee defense, your 38 melee attack, you'd just be chopping away at them shields and not doing anything. So that weapon strength isn't going to do shit. But extra melee attack will allow you to bash through those shields and actually hit them with that weapon strength. So this is a mismatched fucking ability, and they should do melee defense for melee attack, and then of course vice versa. That's how they should do it. But that's just on those particular units. I don't really have anything to say about the other units. But yeah, recruiting them earlier, and then over here we've got a bit of a change to these two here. So used to be able to build both of these in the same settlement, and now they're mutually exclusive. So now the optimal way to go about it is build the Horde in the early game, demolish it around turn 80, and then build this one. Because this one here, in the early stages of the campaign, if you fight a battle, that extra 4% income from post-battle loot, is that going to make you 500 extra gold when you're fighting a tier 1 army or tier 2 army? Probably not. Especially if you're not fighting a battle every single turn. But in the later stages of the campaign, you'll have more armies, so that's more times that this triggers, and the armies will be worth more, and so there'll be bigger loot pools from it. So that extra 4%, like in the early stages, that 4% might be worth 200 extra, but in the later stages, it might be worth 2,000 extra. That might be much. Let's say 500 extra, but it's also applied over the 5 battles that you fought, so it's worth a lot more. So you basically demolish them later down the track, you end up in the red, and then just build loads of those, and you end up massively making money from loot. Bit of a weird way of going about it, but I don't know, maybe people enjoy it. I don't know. Okay, then the other thing that they tweaked was the scrap upgrade. I think this was the best element that they changed with this update here, making it so that you can put more than one scrap upgrade, but each upgrade will cost more than the one that came before it. That's a good system, because this will make it so that units that you invest into will be able to have more value as you put more scrap into them, so you don't necessarily have to disband the unit or replace it earlier, giving you basically a longer use out of lower tier units if that's what you want to do. And that complements Gorbad's campaign in particular. I never thought that the scrap mechanic was particularly good, and I still don't think it's anything special now, but it is better now for sure. The thing is with the scrap upgrade is because it relies on your units, and the thing is the Greenskin units is one of, in my opinion, one of the worst rosters in the entire game. They've just got so many impotent units. So when I take a unit like Orc Boys, right, for example, this is one that I would call an impotent or tactically flaccid unit. This is a unit that has no special abilities, has no specialities whatsoever. It's just combat stats. If it goes up against a unit of Orc Boys that has the exact same combat stats, it will always just like deliver its exact value. And there are many situations where it will just deliver less than its value. So these are tactically flaccid units. Whereas units such as Nasty Skulkers, or just goblins in general, they're usually a lot more tactical. They've got something that gives them an edge in a situation, whether it be stalking, being able to vanguard deploy, poison attacks, something that makes the tactics, the actual decisions that you're doing in battle, more useful for other units that you're doing. But all these guys here are basically providing a meat shield. I mean, it's a tier 1 unit, so it's fine if they don't do anything. But the Greenskins have got a lot of tactically flaccid units that don't really provide much value in most situations. It's just got a lot of really trashy units. And so scrap upgrades on trash units, like you're just polishing a turd. You're so much better off ignoring those turds, building your better units, which are few and far between, and polishing those so that you just make a better unit even better. Like, focus on your strengths rather than mitigating your weaknesses. And then as for the update, I was really hoping that they would tweak the Waaagh system a little bit, which they didn't. Primarily in terms of when you have a Waaagh army attached to your army, any campaign movement range bonuses that Lord has basically get negated because you only move at the pace of the slowest unit, which will always be the Waaagh units. And that has some real big strategic ramifications. So you might argue, boy, yeah, you got a big army, so you should move slower on the campaign map. The problem is the way the AI behaves. If your army is stronger than theirs, they will just run away from you and, build some more armies and come at you. And if your army is weaker than theirs, then you won't be able to run away from them. So it makes you strategically less competent, and the units that get put into these armies are tactically flaccid in most cases. Lots of basic goblins, or basic Orc Boys. So Waaagh units which you don't get to recruit yourself. Just a lot of the time the Waaagh armies are quite shit, and so there's a lot of problems with them. I was hoping they'd tweak that a little bit, but it's still better than the original system. The one that floating army that would go and basically get killed and then tank your reliability because it counted as a treaty being broken. I'm glad that system is gone. So I do hope that they can tweak it. Because usually what I do is I start a Waaagh, and then I usually just disband my Waaagh army because it slows me down. It makes me take 2 turns to get to a settlement that's undefended as opposed to 1 turn. I'm just like, fuck, I don't need these units, and I just disband them, which is disappointing. But anyway, let's now talk about Gorbad Ironclaw. So Gorbad Ironclaw is far from my favorite legendary lord. I don't think he's a bad legendary lord added into the game, but I think he really, to me, insinuates like more of the same. He is just more Greenskin that is just Greenskin through and through, and there's already been loads of Greenskin, and so I was kind of hoping to see something a bit different. I get that he's got this ability, this campaign mechanic here called Tactic, and we'll get to that in a bit, but it's insubstantial in my opinion. Alright, so let's talk about Gorbad in terms of him personally. So overall, I think he's got pretty okay combat stats. He's not the greatest warrior in the game, but that's not really what he's supposed to be. He's sort of be like the great leader, and he kind of is able to achieve that, because he's got some pretty good global bonuses. Character experience gain plus 10% is definitely good. Research rate plus 15, it's good. Ability, the boss's plan. These are okay. That one there. It only affects one unit though. There seems to be a lot of incentive with the Greenskins to have a bunch of like clicky abilities. Like you want to be pushing down abilities all the time. And Creative Assembly seems to think that that's tactics. I mean, it is, but it's not good tactics. Like, satisfying tactics, in my opinion, is where your units are able to envelop the enemy and actually crush them in a satisfying manner and cause a mass rout. Not, buff. Here's a buff for that unit, here's a buff for that unit. That's really boring and just like clicking stuff. It feels like more like League of Legends type stuff. I don't know, I never played League of Legends. So I don't really like that style of just like putting down a bunch of really small impact abilities. Like if you don't use this ability here or this one here and you forget about it for say 5 minutes, how much impact on the battlefield is that really going to have? Minimal. So minimal impact stuff, especially in a game that has Foot of Gork in it, like that's what you're going to focus on. This stuff here might be responsible for getting about 100, 200, 300 extra damage on an enemy, whereas a Foot of Gork will wipe out an entire unit basically. So it's just about focusing on the abilities that are actually going to provide value as opposed to things that don't provide as much value, even though you can of course use this without costing Winds of Magic. It's just low impact. Then we've got this one here. Melee attack and weapon strength and melee defense for all melee infantry faction wide. That's really good for sure. So by this means alone, Gorbad is a important legendary lord for any Greenskin faction. So confederating him should be a value, because melee infantry is sort of some of their best units. Not all of their melee infantry, but Nasty Skulkers and Black Orcs, they are good units, and Savage Orcs are also really good for sure. And giving them extra combat capabilities, that's good, even if it's not in this army. Now, another thing with Gorbad is that he's got a lot of buffs to, like, just not specific units, but for specific categories of units. Sort of leading you to believe that you're incentivized to build a variety in your army. Like, build some missile units, build some cavalry, build a couple of Waaagh units. But this isn't actually correct, because some of these are better than others. And as I've said before, it is way more optimal to just lean into a strength as opposed to mitigate a weakness. Now, Greenskins are not good missile unit faction units. Typically speaking, I mean, apart from like maybe Doom Divers, most Greenskin missile units are just not as good as other missile units from other factions. And so giving them extra ammunition and missile strength, mitigating their weaknesses so they can compete with other factions' strengths, not a good idea to do that. It is far better off to lean into your strengths than mitigate your weaknesses. So stuff like this one here, like Strider and Speed for cavalry. Greenskin cavalry still not the best compared to other factions, but their cavalry is a hell of a lot better than their missile units, so that's pretty good. But I think what really benefits him is like leaning heavily into getting the Waaagh mob units and pumping them into his army. Probably best just like spamming him with like a feral hydra spam or lava arachnarok spiders even. But it's entirely up to you how you want to go about it. That's the thing that I think is appealing for a lot of people for Gorbad Ironclaw, is that he provides you with enough options that you not just lean down one particular unit spam that is clearly like his way to go. Like for example with Alithana, it's just a random example. Alithana is like, you gotta go with Shadow Warriors. That's the thing he boosts. Anything else, like, why would you bother? Whereas him, you really could mix and match. You can make it any way that you want to go with Gorbad Ironclaw, but there is, in my opinion, an optimal path, which is the Waaagh mobs. Thing is, Waaagh mobs takes a while to accumulate a lot of them, so you got to make do with others in the meantime. Overall, pretty generic in every other way. Like him having a what's it called, a boar, Narla as a mount, that kind of makes him kind of less effective in combat personally than just a generic Greenskin Lord, because at least they get a wyvern. He doesn't get a wyvern, he's not able to fly, he gets a pig. And that's fine. I mean, Waaagh gets a pig. doesn't get a wyvern. But Waaagh fucking casts spells like crazy. Gorbad doesn't. Gorbad is not personally good on the battlefield. He's a good commander. Well, he's an okay commander, basically. Some of these buffs, they're okay. That one's particularly good. Anyway. Now let's talk about tactics. Now, I think this is an interesting thing to call it tactics when the vast majority of them are actually strategies. So it's like, not very many of these are actually tactics. And so I feel the need to sort of describe to people, what is the difference between a strategy and a tactic, right? It's not that big of a deal if you want to use the term interchangeably, but the whole point of language is so we understand what the fuck we're talking about, right? So, strategies is basically anything that you do on the strategic level, the campaign map. Anything that I do here in this mode is a strategy, right? Now, obviously, applying this now is strategic, right? Now, you can make this a tactic if the effects of it apply on the battlefield, but a lot of the time it affects the campaign side of things. So if we take Gorbad's boys, right? Reduced upkeep costs for all Orc boys and Orc boy units, well, that has no impact on the battlefield whatsoever. So that's strategic. But this one here, this is actually tactical. Passive ability Gorbad's boys for Orc boys and Orc boy units. The problem with this here is that it's incredibly low impact on units that were already shit. So, base weapon strength plus 5%. Whoa, that's such a huge amount. That is going to make no difference whatsoever. Melee attack plus 8, that will make a difference because that increases their chance to hit by quite a bit. Leadership plus 4, not a huge amount, but that'll help negate very hard battle difficulty. But here's the real kicker. You have to keep a lord or hero near them in order to keep this going. So if you really want to lean into this one here, it's kind of incentivizing you to have a lot of heroes or to have basically a blob, so that Gorbad can to basically boost them all. Now that would be extraordinarily weak. This is not a good one for a blob. So overall, Gorbad's boys is an incredibly low impact tactic and one that you could just forget about. I'm not going to go through all of these because there's lots of them, but basically these plans here, obviously there's 3 different categories, they can be categorized as fucking impactless flaccid shit and some really fucking good ones. And it's pretty obvious which are the good ones and which are the bad ones. They didn't balance this stuff very well at all. So in the ones that are immediately available, there are some that are impactless flaccid shit, such as net them up, right? So this one here, missile strength for missile cavalry and chariot units plus 15%. This is impactless shit because the Greenskin missile cavalry chariot units are shit. These units here, especially because you're going up against dwarves in the early games, they don't have much armor piercing. Leaning into your weakness, basically, by recruiting these units, not a good one to get. Light them up over here. This one's not terrible, but flaming attacks and having flammable, increasing their damage output by a little bit. Again, you're leaning into your missile units, and it's not by a substantial amount. If you want to be able to make these units these tactics actually useful, they need to be by a much more substantial amount. Otherwise, these units are just outclassed by other units in your roster. Especially when you've got something like Erdman Talon. Now, this one here got nerfed by like half, and it's still more powerful than the rest of them. Again, reduced upkeep cost by a pretty minimal amount, but getting melee defense and damage resistance and unbreakable for these units, well, up to that amount, incentivizes a 1 unit spam of a very easily replaceable unit that's very good against the enemy that you're going up against early, which will probably be dwarves unless you go south against Skaven, in which case it's still going to be good against Skaven because most of them are infantry. Basically, no matter which direction you go, you're going up against infantry, right? You got armor piercing, you got anti-infantry, and then when you add in the melee defense and the ward save, you significantly boost a really bloody cheap unit. So that's like objectively the best one. And then as you go through here, you will see that there's plenty that basically boost a bunch of shit units and don't really make them substantially better. And then eventually you get to these ones here. This one's called Bitter Strategits, so it's kind of recognizing that there's strategies here with this, so that's okay. But then you get to here. Like these ones do get quite impactful, but you're boosting basically 1 unit spams with a lot of it. And I feel like, well, to get the most amount of value out of it. So for example, the one where the giants can eat themselves to heal, really bloody impactful. Not particularly, they didn't even check that you could just use that on itself, and it doesn't even hurt itself to do it. these ones here, this campaign mechanic basically is fairly low impact, and the incentivizers for recruiting varied armies is basically smoke and mirrors. It's not a real incentivization, because if you were to build a good army that makes no benefits from any of these tactics, that is significantly better than making a random ass army that is playing into this mechanic as much as it possibly can and getting insubstantial boosts. So it's not a very good system, in my opinion. It's not very well balanced, and it is too heavily focused on insubstantial buffs for fucking terrible units. The terrible units need to get either more substantial buffs, or they need to get abilities from it. Abilities would make it more tactical. So, yeah, anything that's just applying buffs makes it a strategy, but if it's something that's actually providing, like for example this one here, net them up. While I don't think that that's super good, I mean the missile block chance reduced by 50, that's fine. Again, that's not leaning into our strengths because we don't have very good units in the first place. And 15% of a low number to begin with isn't substantial. Now, when you take into consideration Grom the Paunch, now what Grom the Paunch does is adds like not just a percentage of weapon strength, but actually adds like armor piercing number plus like 4 or something, and makes his goblin units significantly more effective in the battlefield, to make the point where they're not just viable but optimal to use. And this falls flat in comparison to what Grom the Paunch is able to do, especially in the early stages of the campaign. And again, a lot of this just feels quite familiar. So overall, with Gorbad's campaign, I don't think it's I think it's one of the more challenging campaigns of the Four Lords added. He's undoubtedly, in my opinion, the weakest of the four. Well, I should say the least strong of the 4 added. I didn't personally enjoy it, but I also recognize that this campaign was not really designed for a player like me in mind, and I'm okay with that. This was designed for people that are looking to have flavor campaigns. They're not playing on legendary difficulty. They want to make use of the flavor of Greenskins, although in my opinion, most of that flavor tastes like shit, but that's entirely up to you. Just because it's not to my taste doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's not to my taste. So I don't think that Gorbad is bad. It's just not for me, okay? We're going to make that clear. I think it's a bit of a divisive campaign, similar to the Changeling, in which some people will really enjoy the Changeling, and some people will take one look at it and go, nah, not for me. And that's basically how I feel about Gorbad. It's nah, not for me. If I was going to play Greenskins, which are not one of my favorite factions, this is not the campaign that I gravitate towards. I don't think it's the most fun. Too much of it feels too familiar, starting at Black Crag. I played so much through Warhammer 1 and 2 Grimgore from the start position, and so having a new Legendary Lord in the exact same start position with different abilities, but not super impactful, but basically doing the exact same thing, that doesn't resonate as a fresh campaign for me, and that's why I didn't really enjoy this campaign so much. If I was to rate this out of 10, I'd give it a 4 out of 10. I think that some people will love it, some people will hate it. It's divisive. That's not going to get a high score. But if you did enjoy it, then that's great. Anyway, hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video. Hopefully you learned something. If I pissed you off, well, that's just too bad. I'm just being honest about my opinions of it, and I'm sure you can shit on a campaign that I really like, and I don't have a problem with that. Anyway, that's the end of this one. Appreciate you, and we'll see you next time. Later, guys.